I come to the floor as we are at a moment of truth and a moment of incredible importance. And I want to start off by acknowledging the distinguished Republican ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Corker, for the spirit in which we've worked together to marshal forces to bring, I think, some critical legislation to the floor at a critical time in history. And this is the type of relationship that we have had for the last 15 months in which, in some time of partisanship here, every major piece of legislation that has passed out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has passed on a strong bipartisan vote, and I appreciate his leadership and his working with us. Mr. President, let me reiterate what I have said on the Senate floor. President Putin is watching. He's waiting to see what we'll do, waiting to see if we have the resolve to act, waiting to see if he has a green light to take the next step. I believe we need to act now and pass this legislation, and I welcome the flexibility the House has shown in its resolve to move this quickly upon receipt. And although I believe that our response to Russia's annexation of Crimea should have included IMF reforms to strengthen the U.S. role in the international community, that will not be the case. But we still need to act on this issue today. I hope that in short order we can have the IMF reform legislation on the floor and take a responsible vote on an important issue. But let's be clear why we are at this moment. Let's be clear about what happened in the Ukraine over the last several years and what's happening now as Ukraine simply looks westward. Former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was elected on a platform that advocated closer ties to Europe. In fact, his first trip abroad was not to Moscow, but to Brussels to meet the European Union officials. For 3 years, Ukrainian officials negotiated in good faith with their European counterparts. They believed that they did so with their president's support. Ukrainian public opinion polls favored the conclusion of an agreement between the EU and the Ukraine that would increase trade and cooperation, allowing more people, goods, services, and ideas to cross the border from the West. Then on November 21st, Yanukovych flipped 180 degrees. He announced an end to talks with the European Union, and Ukrainians felt bitterly betrayed. For 20 years, Ukraine has struggled to economically develop. They've struggled to establish representative government. They've struggled to achieve a stable way forward, a path of economic security and political democracy. The association agreement with the European Union had promised a path towards those goals. So people were furious, and they took to the streets. They knew from personal experience what the world now knows, that Yanukovych and his government and his family had stolen tens of billions of dollars from Ukrainian taxpayers, jeopardizing the solvency and independence of their country to support a lavish lifestyle while the public went without. The people who took to the Maidan Square in the freezing cold were simply looking westward. They believed that the European Union was their last best hope to break the cycle of corruption. They knew that their future was being stolen. They marched. They took beatings from Yanukovych's paramilitary forces, not for a treaty, but for the hope of a better, more honest, and free Ukraine that it promised. Putin's resorted to outright extortion to keep Ukraine in his sphere of influence, essentially offering to buy Ukraine by offering Yanukovych $15 billion. And it would have worked, but for the uprising of the Ukrainian people who realized that this was a Faustian bargain and that Putin was the devil, not their savior. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians demonstrated for 3 months to call for the president's resignation. On February 22nd of this year, President Yanukovych fled to Russia, and an interim government was installed in the Ukraine. Almost immediately, Russian forces took control of the Crimean Peninsula, a clear violation of international law, Russia's own commitments under the Budapest Agreement and the Helsinki Final Act. This demands a swift and coordinated and powerful response from the international community and from this Congress. It demands a message to Putin of our resolve and to the Ukrainian people of our support. That message came in part on March 13th when the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed by a bipartisan vote of 14-3 the support for the sovereignty, integrity, democracy, and economic stability of the Ukraine. In addition to providing $1 billion in loan guarantees for Ukraine to provide crucial support to stabilize Ukraine's economy, this legislation authorizes assistance for democracy, governance, and civil society programs, as well as for enhanced security cooperation. It provides support to the Ukrainian government to help recover assets linked to corruption by former President Yanukovych, his family, and other government officials. It imposes sanctions against those who are responsible for violent human rights abuses against anti-government protesters, as well as those responsible for undermining the peace, security, stability, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of the Ukraine. It imposes asset freezes and visa revocations on Russian officials and their associates who are complicit in or responsible for significant corruption in the Ukraine, and authorizes sanctions against any Russian official engaged in corruption in the Ukraine or in Russia. Putin's cronies should recognize that Putin may not be the right horse to be betting on any longer. Finally, it sends a powerful message to Russia that there are consequences for using force to annex sovereign territory against the established norms of the international community. Now, Mr. President, take one other moment to say I have read some editorials that suggest that Ukraine is really not that important to us, that it's more important to Europe than it is to us. What's our interest? Well, let me offer a few observations of what's our interest as the United States. We have for some time been working to see the Ukraine move to a democratic, stable government, looking westward, and in doing so strengthening a big part of Eastern Europe at the end of the day in a way that strengthens the security of that region and the fiscal opportunities of that region. We look at the Ukraine and we say to ourselves, while they are not a NATO member, but other NATO allies, some of which I met with when I was in Brussels this past week, who are NATO members, are watching and saying, what will Europe and the United States do in the face of Russian aggression? What is our ultimate security going to depend on? We are a NATO member. We are, under Article 5 of NATO's treaty, ultimately supposed to be protected because we are committed to the protection of all of our other neighbors under NATO. And some of those countries actually meet the full responsibility they have on the NATO to pay their quota for the collective defense. Now, Ukraine's not a NATO member, but they are looking at what the West's resolve is in the face of this aggression as the possibility of Russian forces moving further west and saying, is NATO going to stand up for me? And that agreement is one of the fundamental institutions that have created security on the European continent, for which America twice sent its sons and daughters abroad to ultimately guarantee that security. We need to ensure that NATO continues to be a vibrant entity for the collective security of the United States and of Europe. This is another reason why we are interested. Thirdly, I would just simply say, as I have said on the Senate floor before, the world is watching. China is watching. And they're wondering what America and the West will do as they look at territories that they dispute with our allies, Japan and South Korea and the South China Sea, and say, well, the West let Putin get away with this. Why should we not take those territories? There'll be no consequence. Or as we are negotiating with Iran across the table to stop their nuclear weapons program, the Iranians will look and say, well, how much will the West really punish Russia for this aggression? Because if there isn't much consequence, then why should I not try to either get the maximum of this deal or not accept a deal at all. Or North Korea, who wants to advance even further its missile program, which already possesses nuclear capability. What is their calculation? And I could go across the globe, Mr. President, describing that this moment, beyond the Ukraine, how the European Union and the United States acts will send a very clear message to world actors. And that message, hopefully, will be one of strength, because in doing so, we may avert the consequences of security challenges across the globe, avert the possibility that we will have to send our sons and daughters into harm's way, if we act decisively, if we act with strength. And that is the opportunity we have here today. The world is watching, Mr. President, and we must rise to the challenge, and passing this legislation goes a long way towards that goal. That is both the opportunity and the responsibility before the Senate today. And I urge my colleagues to speak with one voice. I hope that we get as near to unanimity as possible, as we have done in other times, for example, on the question of sanctions on Iran. This is such a moment. If the Senate speaks with one voice, I think President Putin will understand the consequences of miscalculating further. And I hope that is the opportunity that we will avail ourselves of today. And in doing so, send a message beyond Putin, but to the rest of the world, that we have the resolve necessary to rise to such challenges.